I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life. Later That Same Life is my weekly podcast. In each new episode, a topic, discussion, or story from our lives.
Season 5, Chapter 12.
Space Force.
Space Force.
Space Force!
Remember the Donald's idea for a brand new branch of the U.S. military? The first new branch in over 7 decades?
Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement.
And it was to be called Space Force. Perhaps even his idea for the name. And when you say Space Force, you can't just say Space Force. It just feels like it has to come out Space Force. When Trump first instructed the Pentagon, and remember, in America, the president is also commander-in-chief of all the armed forces. Eek. Anyway, he first instructed the Pentagon in June of 2018 to begin planning a new military branch. Space Force. You see, I didn't even want to do it that time. It just came out that way. As soon as the word got out, it quickly became just another punchline in the already tasteless joke that was the Trump presidency to date. Late Night had a field day.
Longtime viewers of the Trump administration will remember that Space Force is the president's boldest idea that he got from a Buzz Lightyear Happy Meal toy.
The Space Force is actually happening. They've got plans, they're finding money. Michael Bay is on board to direct the whole thing.
People are talking about this today. The U.S. Space Force unveiled a uniform prototype for its members. Finally, look at this. Right now, every New York City doorman is like, are we in the Space Force?
Actually, they've since improved the uniform a little bit, but part of the joke was that the Space Force symbol was very, very similar to the Star Trek logo. You know, that little chevron-like badge that Picard used to just tap so that he could talk to anyone? You know, Star Trek had Bluetooth.
Red alert. All hands stand to battle stations.
So the Star Trek Starfleet Federation symbol is actually not a chevron, it's a delta. A delta with a star kind of orbiting around it. Real life Space Force symbol? Very similar. And people have wondered hypothetically on why CBS Viacom or the Gene Roddenberry estate wouldn't sue the government for copyright infringement. So this is not the definitive answer, but Roddenberry and his creation of a Federation force trekking through space often borrowed from current military insignia. The delta shape for U.S. Air Force Space Command was actually around long before Shatner ever pinned one onto his tight golden t-shirt. The two logos are remarkably similar, and at least initially led to many more jokes. And that served to lessen Space Force's credibility as a necessary branch of the U.S. military. Space Force. Okay, really, I'll stop that now. Okay, Space Force. What the hell was that Trump whack job thinking? Well, today I'm here to tell you, in case you didn't know, that it be real. Space Force is happening. And you know what? Not such a bad idea. In this episode, I will tell you what has happened so far and make the case for a Space Force. Now, perhaps it shouldn't belong to just one country, but we'll get to that as well. First, a bit of history. I mentioned that Space Force would be the first new branch of the military in about 75 years, and that it would be, the 6th branch of the U.S. military. So before Space Force, what was the most recent new branch of the military? Kind of a trick question. It was the U.S. Air Force. established in 1947. You're saying, hold on a minute. How could that be? There were American planes and aircraft carriers and flyers well before that. Look at World War II. Well, yes, but during that time, they were actually known as the Army Air Corps, and they didn't really become their own military branch until after the war, 1947. So that was the last new branch of the military before Space Force. In chronological order, it goes Army, then Navy, then Marines, then Coast Guard, and those four were all before 1800. In America's first 20 years of existence, they set up the Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. Fast forward just over 100 years, and the Wright brothers managed to get off the ground in 1903. Within a few years of that, there was an Army Air Corps. And again, by 1947, they became their own unique branch. And most of us have known in our lives that there are 5 branches of the U.S. military. It's part of the reason they call their headquarters the Pentagon. It was designed and built that way. Symbolism. And now it seems Trump has screwed that up too. There's now 6 military branches. What are we going to do with the Pentagon building? Well, we can take out the south wall over there and then make that into 2 walls pointing that way. There'll be 2 sections then out of that, and we can call it the hexagon. Because really now it should be the hexagon, shouldn't it? Can you imagine?
A hexagon spokesperson said today the U.S. military strategists at the hexagon have revealed that a hexagon.
We could get used to it. Right now, poor Space Force, right? New branch of the military. Hey, we're the Pentagon, 5 military branches. We each have our own section of the building. Now, Space Force. You know, maybe we can clean out that storage area in the basement, set up some chairs and desks. 6 branches need a hexagon. All right. Enough with the hexagon. I've never really understood the logic of it. Okay, you've built an army and a navy. Why wouldn't the Marines just be part of the army? And why wouldn't the Coast Guard just be part of the navy? As I said, the Air Force was part of the army for a long time. Why isn't Space Force just another part of the Air Force? Because, you know, when established, the Air Force's role and mandate was in the warfare of air, space, and cyberspace. And actually, there was a division called the Air Force Space Command. They were created as the global space race heated up. Air Force Space Command is what became this separate branch, Space Force. Hey, speaking of cyberspace, now there should be its own military branch. I'll bet that in practice it already exists, just not with any official capacity or name. The Cyber Corps. That's what I'd call it. A bunch of guys in basements looking at screens. Their uniform could consist of a short-sleeved plaid shirt and cargo shorts. They could be a 7th branch. And if we're going to rebuild the Pentagon, let's build a spare wing or 2, just in case some new military branch comes along. We could call it the Octagon. No, wait, that's already taken by the MMA. Well, I'm sure some deal could be worked out. Space Force was mandated in the summer of 2018, but it was actually signed into existence by President Donald Trump in December of 2019. Here's an interesting thought about that. Let me just say what a difference a year makes. Have you been watching or following the January 6th hearings?
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order.
The J6H, as somebody called them now. Oh yeah, J6H. If so, you will know that riot and insurrection, the J6, came out of a late-night, angry, profanity-laced fist-fight-threatening White House meeting in late December of 2020. Trump, Giuliani, and a few other crazies were trying to make a case to overturn Biden's election to the office by claiming voter fraud. The election was stolen from DJT. Some of the less crazies among them tried to say there was no legal case or hope for this insane plan. Frustrated with a lack of yes men, people who would not help Trump were called pussies by Giuliani. In the middle of the night, Trump tweeted out to his followers,
"Please arrive early. Massive crowds expected. March to the Capitol after. Stop the steal."
He asked his followers to join him in protest. Be there, it will be wild. Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, all the other nut jobs, they took it seriously. And we know what happened. My point is that this came a year, almost to the day, after Trump had signed Space Force into law, an official new military branch. Like there he was, and you can find the footage, announcing Space Force, a new military branch, a new uniform, a new flag, a new insignia. This is all in December of 2019. Meanwhile, he's ready for a campaign the following year in which he's going to get reelected, defeating Sleepy Joe. And then it all goes to hell. And 1 year later, almost to the day, he's in the same room, trying to instigate an illegal takeover, willing to let other people die to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Well, anyway, that was quite the aside, but I just found that interesting. What a difference a year makes. And I mean, January 6th is probably the worst thing Trump has ever done. And just 1 year earlier, he signed off on maybe the only good thing he has ever done. He helped create Space Force. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Air Force has been the military branch responsible for space. And many of those personnel began to form Space Force. Again, Space Force evolving from the Air Force Space Command. The U.S. Air Force Space Command does a lot of things. For example, they operate GPS, the Global Positioning System. It was the Air Force Space Command leader who was tasked with building Space Force. He is currently in charge of the new branch. He is General John W. Raymond, sometimes just called Jay.
There is nothing that we do as a joint force, absolutely nothing, that isn't enabled by space capability.
Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado is the important base supporting much of the space military operation. Space Force began with around 16,000 people, both civilian and military, all under the command of General Raymond. Much of the military are men and women who came from other branches, not just the Air Force Space Command, but also the Army, Navy, and others as well. Since then, Space Force has set up a Guardian boot camp for new recruits in San Antonio, Texas. It looks and sounds a lot like a regular military boot camp, except when they're in the classroom. It's there that these military recruits learn the skills to be space guardians. Guardians of the galaxy, I guess. But as one supervisor pointed out, it's not space camp. This is military boot camp. I imagine somewhere along the line, someone has called them space cadets. I guess they are. And there's no astronauts. These people aren't going to be flying through space firing laser weapons at TIE fighters, hoping they take down Lord Vader. Well, who knows, maybe one day it may come to that. But for now, they will be guarding space from Earth as members of the U.S. military, known as Space Force. As much as I laughed along with everyone when Trump and Mike Pence were making these announcements,
now the time has come to write the next great chapter in the history of our armed forces, to prepare for the next battlefield, where America's best and bravest will be called to deter and defeat a new generation of threats to our people, to our nation. The time has come to establish the United States Space Force.
I've altered my opinion of this new military branch. General Raymond.
The challenge is that integration of space into everything that we do provides us great advantage. And there's countries that don't like that advantage that it's providing us, and they are building capabilities to keep us from accessing space.
Okay, so this is part of the podcast where I go nuts over numbers. I know not everyone likes them, but I do. And they do tell a story. Satellites help almost everything that we do. Space, the final frontier. Well, we don't actually know that for sure, do we? And although we haven't exactly conquered it, we've certainly managed to clutter it up pretty good. The United Nations currently recognizes about 90 spacefaring countries. That's about half of the countries in the entire world. And right now, up there are approximately 6,542 artificial satellites. They are floating and orbiting above us. According to General Jay, there's about another 57,000 on the drawing board. There are right now astronomers complaining about the night sky, that it's twinkling in a very different way. Visible stars and planets, etc., combined with thousands of satellites. Kind of a late night light pollution. About 1/3 of the known official satellites are from private interests. Most of those, by the way, are SpaceX. Musky. I mentioned there was 90 spacefaring countries. Technically, you don't even have to have rocket technology to be one of those countries. You just have to hitch a ride, rent a rocket, and launch your satellite. And boom, you're in space. The International Space Station is about the area of a large 5-bedroom home. But satellites can also be the size of a toaster. Doesn't matter, as long as you get it up there and it's beaming information back to Earth. Space junk is so bad, there's already like a 1-800-GOT-JUNK for space. Not, literally, but yeah. It's getting trickier and trickier up there just to navigate around all the debris. And people have been trying to figure out how to get it out of there so we can put more junk up there. One idea, and this is true, is a giant magnet satellite that sucks up all the used garbage and then crashes back down to Earth, dumping it all into the deep sea. Good plan. But let me point out that Space Force is not Tony Soprano. In other words, they are not in the waste management business. They are also not freight dispatchers. Space Force is military. That's a whole other meaning, isn't it? I mean, I get it. The U.S. is always all about the military. More military. Many have argued against that mentality, but at least half the world is also probably very thankful that they are so militarized. The world police and all. Now they are the first to militarize space. At least that we know of. Space Police. Space Force. And of those 90 spacefaring nations, recognized as so by the UN, the UN also knows that many governments around the world work closely with the US, Russia, and China to develop technology that would allow them to destroy satellites in space in the case of a crisis. Here's where it gets interesting. Time magazine has reported that in November of 2019, Russia launched a satellite into orbit. What was odd was that shortly after it reached orbit, that satellite launched its own separate satellite. And within 2 months of that, the other satellites started to nestle up to one of the United States' premier military spy satellites. It's known as the KH-11. What? Through diplomatic channels, according to Time magazine, the Russians were told to back off. They did. But a few months later, and this is according to General Raymond, that satellite fired a projectile into space. Well, Were the Russians intending to fire that projectile into a U.S. military spy satellite? Or were they just trying to tell the U.S. that they could do that if they wanted to? So what now? Does the U.S. have to send up satellite weaponry? Relax, don't do it. In the mid-60s, many nations signed on to something that has been called the Treaty of Space. Its full name is actually the Treaty of Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. Okay, Space Treaty. Among many things, it says that you can't have a nuclear weapon in space. I guess now we're assuming that everyone is still keeping to that agreement. Other than that one treaty, as General Raymond has said, space is like the wild, wild west. The treaty also says that all space exploration is to be carried out for the benefit of all nations and peoples on Earth. Well, we know that concept evaporated a long time ago. It's become competitive. Every country for itself. All of this to say that a military division called Space Force no longer sounds like such a goofy idea. I suppose we need someone up there to patrol the region, ticket the illegally parked, check around for vagrants and ne'er-do-wells, make an arrest occasionally when necessary. Problem is, it's America, and American military is designed to look out for American interests. It doesn't matter what country or galaxy they're in. I do suspect that Russia or China already also have a space force, just not under that name, perhaps, or, with snazzy Star Trek insignias. And if it is the wild, wild west out there, well, I guess now there's a new sheriff in town. Shoot first, ask questions later. It seems us Earthlings aren't quite content enough with just destroying the planet. We're bored, so let's destroy the atmosphere, and then, in order, the troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere, all on our merry way to Mars, where we can turn that into a Walmart parking lot with a nearby Starbucks. And if we have any problems along the way, we just call Space Force. I'm fascinated by this whole thing. I'm fascinated by space. Always have been. In school, I took up space. Now, come on. You really didn't think I was going to make it all the way through a podcast about space without doing one of my favorite old groaner jokes? I mean, I lasted as long as I could.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.